Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Distilled Living Podcast with Thelma Zilla, where we talk about real life and break it down so we can level up. Let's jump in. On today's episode, we want to talk about change. I've entitled this episode, Is It Time to Pivot? Is it time to pivot? We want to look at what are some of the things in your life that need to change and what's stopping you from making the change. Before we dive into this, let's set the context. A lot of people hate change. I'm one of them as well. I do in certain cases, I don't like change. However, ironically, I'm also a certified change manager. What that means is I help businesses and organizations to make strategic decisions that allow them to change and help their people to enable that change to happen. So I'm constantly involved in some sort of change projects. But in my own personal life, it can be very difficult to apply change and to make some of the changes that I need to make because there's emotions attached to it. There's comfort attached to a lot of this stuff. So I want to start off with a question. How do you know it's time to pivot? How do you know it's time to pivot? I reflected a little bit about this in my own life, and I got about 4 points that I want to talk to us today about, and we can unpack that a little bit. So the first one is you feel stagnant. You're not growing. Everything is just the same. You're just so stagnant. That's, for me, the first indicator that kind of shows that possibly we need to start to look at pivoting. You constantly need to have a growth mindset. And it's very hard to have a growth mindset when you are stagnant. So consider that first point. The next point, how you know it's time to pivot, is that you are in repetitive cycles. What I mean by that is it's literally this year looks exactly like last year, which looks like last year, or just your life, it's just repetitive cycles. Sometimes I describe it as being in a holding pattern. Have you ever flown in a plane and they tell us that, okay, we can't land for such and such a reason, so we're just going to be in a holding pattern until the control tower tells us that it's safe to land. And then all we're doing in midair is just going round and round in circles. You're burning fuel. It feels like you're wasting time, but you're just in a holding pattern. And sometimes life can feel like that you're just in a holding pattern. Nothing is changing. So for me, that's kind of one of those indicators as well that I look for to consider whether or not it's time to pivot. The third one is around your comfort zone. Let's face it, the majority of us, and let me not say all, but the majority of us tend to be creatures of habit. We have our comfort zone. It's a comfort zone for a reason. It brings comfort, makes us happy. And sometimes we can literally, how do I put it? You miss the opportunities that lay ahead of you because you are in your comfort zone. You don't want to change. You don't want to disrupt that. It's just too difficult. You might feel like, you're too old for this, or you can't take any more risks, or you can't afford to, for whatever reason. Life is just comfortable the way it is. But seldom does growth and opportunity live in your comfort zone. It doesn't. And then the last thing you want to look at when you're considering whether or not it's time to pivot is the timing or the opportunities that are before you. You've got to start to look around you to see where are the opportunities, what should you be taking advantage of? And as you do that, you'll start to see that, well, okay, if I make this move and if I pivot, I'll be able to capitalize on those opportunities. So those are the 4 that in my own life I look at to help me consider when it's time to pivot. That being said, the next question I want us to think about is, what's stopping you from pivoting? Or what's stopping you from making that change, whatever that looks like in your own life? It could be a job, it could be even changing careers, it could be moving cities, it could be, a relationship, whatever it is. What's stopping you from pivoting or making those changes? So I got a couple of things for us to consider, which tend to be quite common. The first one is fear. Fear is a real emotion. It is a crippling emotion at best when it's fully manifested. Fear of the unknown is the big one, especially for me. What if things don't work? I tend to be I think in the past, as a younger person, I tended to take more risks. And I was okay with that, but sometimes some of the risks didn't, map out the way I thought it should. And that kind of left a little bit of a burn where you feel like, ooh, I don't know if I want to do that again. And you tend to be a little bit more fearful or more scared. But somebody said that a lot of the things you want are on the other side of fear. And I actually believe that. A lot of the things we want or the life you want to live are on the other side of fear. And it's about overcoming that fear in order to unlock the door and the possibility of what your life can become. The second thing for me that I've noticed can stop people from making the changes in their lives is losing control. For me personally, I like to know what's going to happen. A certain degree of control is comfortable for me. I'm a planner. I've got plans upon plans, contingencies, that kind of stuff. You want to be in control. And that can stop you from, jumping into the great big unknown and pivoting because you lose control. You are in an uncertain environment. You're walking uncharted territories. You've never been here before. But that's the beauty about it. It's in these uncharted territories that possibility and opportunity rest. So oftentimes it's worth making that pivot. The next thing that stops us from, pivoting, and it's the aspect around familiarity, that comfort zone. Once again, never underestimate comfort. It is such a pull. It is a great pull to just not disrupt the status quo, keep things as they are. And sometimes you can be so miserable and so unhappy, but because it is comfortable and we know how things go, we have control, it's worth not upsetting the cart, so to speak. The next one that I've observed that stops people from pivoting is actually people. People. And what I mean by that is it can be very difficult to make changes because those changes can mean leaving people behind, whether it's leaving friends or leaving colleagues or, leaving a city that you're familiar with, and then you have to start again. And that pool of people makes it very difficult for you to just, walk away. You've invested so much time in those relationships, and simply by pivoting, it means that you may lose those relationships, and that can be a very difficult thing to make a change. However, the converse is true. if you make that pivot or if you make that change, it can open the door for other relationships. There are people that you have never met yet that are pivotal to your destiny. And you will only get to meet them when you make those shifts or make those changes that will bring you into new environments and new places and new rooms, so to speak. But yeah, never underestimate people. And then sometimes people can be a discouraging factor. Maybe you've made up your mind that this is what you want to do, but people with their influence and their opinions, and depending on, the degree of the relationships you have with these people, they're very influential. And what they say or what they think concerning your move or your change can actually put you off from making those changes. So you got to be mindful about that. Yeah, because even when we look at change management as a discipline, you look at how people resist change. So that resistance of change amongst people can really make change very difficult. So it's very true. People can make it difficult for you to make those pivotal changes in your life. The other thing that I've observed is that you're not prepared for the pivot. You're not prepared for the change. See, change doesn't just happen. You actually have to plan for change. You actually have to have a roadmap that's going to lead you to a successful change from point A to point B. You don't leave change to chance. Even from a business perspective, when we look at it as a discipline, we don't leave, businesses or companies to make strategic changes without the right plans, that can help them navigate that. And in our own personal lives, we sometimes don't give that attention to what that change is going to look like. Are you prepared for that? Is there a plan, for your change? What steps do you need to put in place to allow you to pivot successfully, instead of blundering the pivot, if you want to put it that way. So for me, those are the things that I have observed. And I'll just repeat them once again. So the common things that stop people from pivoting. First one is fear of the unknown. The second one is losing control. The third one is, that familiarity, the comfort zone. The fourth one is people, the relationships that they have, or the influence that people have on them to discourage or resist that change. And then the last one is not being prepared for the pivot. You don't have a plan. And that common saying that if you don't have a plan, you plan to fail. So it's so important to approach it systematically with regards to the pivot or the changes that you're trying to make in your own life. The third question I want us to look at today is, what happens when you don't pivot? What happens when you don't pivot? Sometimes you need to sit down, grab a notebook, and write these questions and answer them for yourself so you can see what your life is going to look like if you don't make that pivot. The first one, which is the biggest thing that happens when you don't pivot when you're supposed to, is that you miss opportunities. You miss opportunities. And that's a scary thing because it's not like opportunities come around all the time, And when you miss those opportunities, sometimes you have to wait for years before another similar opportunity comes. So to me, that's probably the hardest thing that happens when we don't make changes, when we don't pivot when we're supposed to. The next one is around stunted growth. Yes, stunted growth. Think of your life like a bonsai tree. They're so cute, the little bonsai trees, so cute. But they kind of have stunted growth. They can't grow any bigger than the little environments that they find themselves in. But for them to actually grow, they need to be planted out into a bigger space. So it's the same with our own lives. If you feel like you have stunted growth, you need to start looking at ways to shift and pursue a growth trajectory in your own life. It's never too late to do that. It doesn't matter how old you are, you have to keep growing. See, one of the things that my dad instilled in my life as a little girl, and even till this day as an adult, is that my dad always used to say, learning never ends. Learning never ends. And he always had this growth mindset, this learning mindset, this hunger to continue to learn and explore and research, and he instilled that in us as kids, myself and my siblings. And that's the beauty about pursuing change, is that you continue to grow. You continue to walk this path of a growth trajectory when you pursue change. The next thing I believe that's quite common when you don't pivot and you don't make those changes is that frustration and inner turmoil begin to build up. I don't know if you've ever felt so frustrated in your life, knowing fully well that you are so capable and you are able to do more than what you are doing right now. Like, that your life can be so much better than what it is right now. The reality and your potential are constantly at odds, but your reality wins all the time instead of your potential winning. And that can be so frustrating. And I know that because I have lived that at times where I feel frustrated because I can't seem to, live out my potential. But the main reason is it happens is when I am not pursuing a growth trajectory that requires me to change, to shift, to move. The next one is mediocrity. So what happens when you don't pivot? You become mediocre. You become average. That's okay for some people, but when you know that you are not a mediocre person, you're not built for average, that is not okay. And that becomes very difficult when you're looking at your life thinking, surely there's more to this. There's more to my life than this. So yeah, mediocrity creeps in pretty quick. And if you stay there and accept that status quo of being mediocre, it just becomes the norm. And days turn into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. It repeats itself. And in the end, you're just a mediocre person. So, knowing all of this, it kind of gets you thinking, what do I need to do to make those changes in my life? What do I practically need to do to make those changes in my life? I don't want to overcomplicate things for you. It's pretty simple. Take a notebook or write it on your computer and come up with a plan. What are the steps that you need in order to make those changes? I can guarantee you that you will regret more not having made the change than having attempted to make the change and changed. You want to live a life that at least you gave it a shot. At least you had the courage to do what you needed to do, instead of just wallowing in frustration because it is what you know. It's comfortable. You're in your comfort zone with your regular people. When you're built for more, you've got to be prepared to pivot. Not once, not twice, but you got to pivot for as many times as you need to pivot to capitalize on the opportunities that lay before you. So, there's more to you than what you're living right now. So have some courage, believe in yourself, and get a plan. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to talking to you next time.